Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. Okay, we've had a very interesting discussion in the chat box during the input session, and there were some very interesting questions and a couple of very interesting concepts which came up. One of the things was the concept of growth mindset, and this is something that I would like to talk about in a moment, if that's okay with you. And I would like to start off our discussion by asking you to write in the chat box the types of feedback that you have given in the past couple of days. Okay, so in the chat box, if you could write the types of feedback that you've been giving over the past couple of days, and try to focus on your work in the classroom, okay? So try to focus on your teaching rather than feedback in general. Okay. Okay, so let's see if anybody is going to give us some information on the kind of feedback that you've been giving in the past couple of days. Feedback on grammar, definitely. So this is one of the types of feedback that we have talked about, and that is feedback on language. Yeah, so probably correction when students made a mistake in, for example, learning about a grammar structure. Feedback on writing, describing data, and that probably is something to do with an IELTS exam. Okay. Feedback on progress in general, direct pronunciation correction, excellent. Okay. Any other ideas about different types of feedback? One of the things that I wrote in the chat box during the input session was that I find that the type of feedback that I give really depends on the student's age. So for example, when I teach teenagers, I find myself giving quite a lot of feedback on behavior. And of course, there is language feedback, on the mistakes that they're making when they're practicing a given piece of language, the target language that we're focusing on at any given moment. But as I said, we do sometimes need to have a little chat about their behavior or their attitude to the teacher, to the learning process, or to other students. I can see feedback on reading. Okay, I think from my own experience, and some of these things have already been mentioned by some of you, I find, of course, correction, because this is something that we do a lot of in the classroom. As I've already mentioned, feedback on behavior, especially when we teach younger learners, so children or teenagers. But also feedback about progress over a period of time, which I think somebody has mentioned already. Yes, I think Gabby mentioned that. Also feedback on written tasks, but also because I do, for example, when I work with teenagers, I tend to do quite a lot of project work, and I find that it's very important to give students feedback on the process to help them along in the project, because obviously project needs to be, project is something that takes a little bit more time. And so you don't want a situation where students, for example, after a certain period of time in the middle of the project, suddenly find out that they don't really know where to go from there. Gulbin, thank you very much for wonderful comments. Okay. Now, is there anything else? Oh yes, if you do placement testing, for example, then you will give feedback on the placement testing results. You will also find yourself giving feedback on test results, or on results of a review of a certain portion of material. Also, if you're teaching an exam class, then you will probably find yourself giving feedback on mock exam results. But also, if you use peer feedback in the classroom, then you will find yourself giving feedback to those students who actually provide peer feedback, to give them a sense of whether they're actually on the right track in providing feedback to their classmates. And I think when we think about teaching or whatever happens, or when we think about what happens in the classroom, any kind of encouragement is really feedback. Goodwin wrote also, children love detailed feedback. Yes, absolutely. And don't be sorry for writing so long. No, absolutely. These are all very, very useful comments. So thank you very much for those comments, Goodwin. Okay. Anything else from any of you about the types of feedback? I think we've mentioned quite a lot of different types of feedback. I don't think I can think of anything else that I have done in the past week or so. Gabby, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
How did you know? Simply because you must have seen I have unmuted myself. Yeah, I mean, I was wondering, Anya, because as you said, I mean, you've kind of given enough examples of what we give feedback on. But my question now is about how we do that. And there are two things that I want to ask you. The first one is speaking versus writing. So how is the way we provide feedback on a speaking activity different to how we provide feedback on a writing task? And maybe I can just ask you this other question. You just, because I can see you are scribbling down the questions. My other question is, I put it in the chat box earlier, but I really wanted to ask you again. When we have, I mean, do you think it's a bad idea to give different, to use different techniques and to give different kinds of feedback to students who are, to low achieving students and high achieving students, okay? Because that's a big issue, I think. Obviously, we have strong students, weak students. Now, do they need the same type of feedback from you as a teacher? Perhaps they don't. So I wonder what you really think about it, and maybe other attendees would like to comment.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for these questions, Gabby. I think I'll start with the differences and similarities between feedback on speaking and feedback on writing. I think the most obvious difference is the time issue, because most of the time, not always, but most of the time when we give feedback on a written task, it's not immediate, okay? It happens a little bit later because we need time to actually look at what students have written and compare it to the criteria that we have set for those students, and then we can give them feedback. Having said this, you can actually give immediate feedback during writing activity when you use process writing. So when you teach students using a process writing approach, and then you'll be giving them feedback on the steps that they are taking, and these steps take them to the moment when they're actually ready to write a whole piece. So for example, in exam tasks, when they're ready to actually write an essay, or when they're ready to actually write a report. So yes, there is a difference in terms of time, but it's not always true. In speaking, again, we need to look at what is our aim, because, and this is one of the things that came up in the input session, if we are giving students practice in accuracy, so speaking for accuracy, so if this is practicing a new piece of language that they have focused on, then you would probably want to give immediate correction. Again, I think the example that I used in the input session was, if you're teaching conditionals, then students are doing an exercise focusing on conditional sentences. If they make a mistake, then you want to jump in and correct it straight away. But if you're focusing on developing fluency, then your feedback is going to happen after the activity is finished. But you will, of course, want to monitor what's going on, and you want to write down all the things that you have noticed so that you've got something to talk about in your feedback. And then when you actually have the feedback, then, or when you hold the feedback session, then of course, you want to mention the good things and the things that students could improve, for example, in terms of communicative strategy. I think in general, because whether we're talking about speaking or writing, we're talking about productive skills. So the aim of feedback is going to be the same, to improve those productive skills. But the details are going to be slightly different, because you're going to use, because obviously this is different type of communication. So if we have different types of communication, then we need to have different types of feedback. That's what I think about the speaking and the writing. The interesting thing about writing is that time is actually a very, very, very important issue here. That was one of the practical guidelines, the time between event and feedback. Okay, and I'm sure we've all heard stories about teachers not giving back corrected essays or reports to students for weeks on end. And that obviously is unacceptable, because in order for students to learn through feedback, they need to receive feedback as soon as possible and as soon as appropriate. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Gabby, but about the differences or similarities between the speaking and the writing feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless someone else wants to add to this, I absolutely.
Okay. I'm going to come back to your second question, Gabby, in just a moment. But there is an interesting question in the Q&A box. In fluency activities, is it possible to give feedback on things besides communicative strategies? If yes, what else? So this is the question which I think kind of connects with what I've just been talking about, in terms of feedback on fluency activities. I think it's absolutely possible to give feedback on things which are different from communicative strategies. I think it's something that you need to talk to students about, okay? Because if the aim of the activity that you are doing with the students at any particular moment in the classroom is developing fluency, then which means communication, then in feedback you want to focus on communication. But there may be things in terms of language that students would like to get feedback on as well. And if this is what they want, then yes, I would go along with that. So we kind of come back to something that came up in a very strong way in the chat box during the input session, and that is talking to students about why we give feedback and why we give feedback in this particular way. I think this is something absolutely essential. I think the more students understand what we do in the classroom and why we do it, then students are going to be much more independent learners and much more effective learners. And this is one of the aims of what we do in the classroom, is not just teaching language, but ensuring that our students actually become independent learners, that they can take the learning outside the classroom, and that they can be independent in learning the language. So, this was the question from the Q&A box. Now, Gabby, I would like to come back to your second question.
Can I just comment on what you've just said, if I may? Okay, very, very quickly. When you said, because there is something about this kind of, like, students should have this internal criteria for kind of judging correctness. Okay, so I sometimes feel that students are too dependent on teachers. Like, how many times, just if you think back, okay, and remember yourself at school, how many times have you given the correct answer, the right answer, only because you wanted to please the teacher, even though you didn't agree with the answer, right? But we kind of give this answer because we think this is what is expected of us. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not, I mean, the way it's so important how we acknowledge answers from students, right? So a yes answer is a yes answer, but a no answer is never a no answer. I mean, I actually hate to say to a student, no, this is the wrong answer, because I don't care about the actual answer. What is important is the journey and what happened and how the student actually arrived at this answer. So this is about learner independence and about how the way we actually provide feedback affects very much how students arrive at answers and what they think is more important. Is it the fact that the answer is correct, or is it the fact that the answer is not correct, but I have arrived there myself, and even though it's not correct, the thinking process was not faulty. So, I mean, this is again long-winded. Sorry, I don't even know if I'm making my point.
No, you are. You are.
Yeah,
you are absolutely. And I've just written down one word which you used, and that word is journey. And I wanted to thank you for using this word, Gabby, because learning is a journey. Okay, it's not. You know, learning, especially learning a language, it is quite a long journey for quite a lot of people. Okay, sometimes you can learn a language relatively quickly, but still, you know, it is a long, it's a long process. And we need to make sure that students understand that our feedback supports that journey, that our feedback does not focus on the, again, this is something that I mentioned in the input session, on this black and white vision of what success and failure is. Because just to give you an example, if a student uses a complex grammar structure incorrectly, for me, this is really important information that they are really trying to use difficult, complicated, ambitious piece of language. And that means that they're really moving forward. That means that they're making progress. And yes, they may have made a mistake, but you know, without making mistakes, we're not going to learn anything. Yeah? The important thing is that they're trying, that they're really taking a risk. They're taking this plunge into this complicated structure that language is, and they're willing to try. And this is what we need to support. And that's why feedback is such a crucial part of what we do. And that's also why good feedback, effective feedback, is so crucial in teaching. So if I may go back to your second question, Gabby, the question about low achieving students and high achieving students and whether they need different kind of feedback. It's kind of difficult to answer that question with a yes and or a no.
I know, Anya, but I was just hoping that maybe, because there is no yes or no answer to this, but I'm just really curious how you feel about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think first of all, when I think about what kind of feedback I'm going to give to an individual student, one of the most important things that I look at is what kind of person they are. That's number one. And also what kind of feedback they expect. Okay, and this is why I actually talk to my students a lot about feedback, and again, we're going back to this, to those discussions with students and students understanding what's happening in the classroom and why it's happening in this particular way. So So for me, it is very, very important what kind of person they are and what kind of feedback they expect. I think it's kind of, if we say that for low achieving students, we would tend to go in the direction of correction, whereas with high achieving students, we would tend to go in the direction of formative feedback. I think there's a danger of making it, again, black and white. And I don't think there's anything black and white about people. I don't think there's anything black and white about learning. I don't think there's anything black and white about language. So, and we're actually dealing with these three elements put together. I think it really depends. I think the teacher who teaches a given group of students or a given individual student will know best what their students need, hopefully also because they talk to their students. And if they talk to their students and if they observe them, then they will find the best way to meet that particular student's needs. And again, I'm not sure whether that answers your question,
No,
Gabby.
but I just have to say, Anya, that I really put you in a difficult position because I asked you the kind of question that I have no answer to. So that was rather unfair, but it's simply because I have been asking myself this question for a long time and I have no answer. Yeah. So that's why I just took this opportunity to ask you. But again, I just want to say it again. I have no idea how to answer this question. So I guess, personalize it. You know your students, you know who they are, you know what they expect, you know which students need more corrective feedback and which students need more feedback to kind of make them think, right? So very individual. I agree with you.
I don't think that was an unfair question, Gabby, to be quite honest.
Yeah, but if you ask a question you don't know the answer to, well, actually, this is why you ask the question, right?
Well, precisely. But also because it's so individual and because there are no clear-cut answers to this, I think that's what makes for an interesting discussion. And I think, again, it kind of stresses the importance of listening to your students, talking to your students and listening to your students. Because also the thing is that, if you teach somebody for a year or 2 years, which sometimes happens, okay, or if you teach somebody in an intensive course for a month or 2 months or 3 months, that student can change in that time and their needs can change as well. So, even if you've established at the beginning that the student needs this kind of feedback, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will need the same kind of feedback later on. So again, listen to your students. This is so important, and coming back to what you were saying about giving the correct answer because this is what the teacher expects. I think it's so important to show our students that they are at the center of what we do. They're not learning a language to please me, the teacher. They are doing it because they have decided to do it, they need it, or they want it, They, as I said, they are at the center of things. I'm not. I'm actually a person who helps them on that journey. And again, thank you very much, Gabby, for that wonderful word journey, because I think it's such an important word when we talk about teaching in general, but specifically about language teaching.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anya.
So there was something about, Simon said, asking students to give feedback on my teaching as a review of my website. Yeah, I think this is another big area, and this is something that I'm going to talk about in the second workshop of this series. I'm going to mention getting feedback from students as a way of measuring how well they are doing in terms of the learning process. I think that is equally important. I mean, you know, feedback is not a one-way type of communication. Feedback is a two-way communication. So it's not just about me giving feedback to the student or to the students, but it's also about collecting feedback from them, and for a number of different reasons. Okay, I would like to go back for a moment to the reflective questions that I suggested for this particular session. So we've talked about the different types of feedback that you can give, but I would also like to look at why feedback can be difficult. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to do something for me. If you could think about the best and the worst feedback that you have received. Okay, so the best and the worst feedback that you have received. And if I could ask you to write in the chat box why the feedback you have received was so good, or why the feedback you have received was so bad. Okay. As a teacher, could be in any particular, in any other situation. Okay, because again, this is feedback is a skill which we use, yes, a lot in the classroom, but not only in the classroom. Okay, so if you could, in the chat box, if you could think about and write in the chat box why a particular feedback that you have received was so good, or why a particular feedback you have received was so bad. And I would like to give you an example of a feedback which I was told about. This is not my personal experience, but this is an experience that I was told about on one of the teacher training courses that I was running. This is one of the teachers told me that when she was studying to be a teacher, so when she was in a teacher training college, she was told by one of her trainers that she'll never be a good teacher. And I think this is possibly, if not the worst, then one of the worst kinds of feedback that I have heard about. And again, if you think about those practical guidelines that I shared with you in the input session, you know, to tell somebody you'll never be a good teacher, that really damages the person. Okay, and actually this person that I'm talking about is the person that was an excellent teacher. She was really, really good in what she was doing. Okay, there are some examples. Best feedback: when you do this happens, so please don't do it because. Yes, excellent. This is when feedback is very specific, and again, it shows you the way forward. From Simon for PE at school, what Simon totally lacks. Oh, what Simon totally lacks in ability, he tries to make up for by effort. Well, this is the kind of feedback that I was receiving in my PE in primary school as well. So I'm with you on that one, Simon. Thank you very much for that example. Good feedback from Corinna. Detailed feedback about public speaking helped my confidence with it. Thank you very much, Corinna, for mentioning the word confidence. This is such an important word when we talk concept, when we talk about feedback. One of the things that we try to do when giving feedback to students is to build their confidence to do things. Learning is one big risk-taking activity, and you need confidence to be able to do it. So this is, confidence is so important. And if you give feedback which is really appropriate and which is really encouraging, then that is going to help the confidence building thing. I hate when people say well done. It just doesn't mean anything. Yes, absolutely. It's just too general. Yeah. Worst, an essay I wrote as a student. I don't know what I was expected to do, and what I wrote reflected that. Yeah, if feedback does not give you any idea of what it is that you need to do, it's a failed feedback, basically, or it's no feedback at all. From Maria, praised for the originality of my presentation by one of the teachers observing a presentation. Okay, Maria, would you like to tell us about this, this example feedback? Okay, Maria is raising her hand, so.
Yes, indeed. Hi, hello everybody. Thank
Hi.
you very much for this fantastic workshop. Yes, what happened was I was studying, and I was studying philology, English and German philology. And we had the English department, we had a very good teacher, and she would always make us prepare presentations that, we would present. For example, sometimes I remember would present nursery rhymes, and would do some research in nursery rhymes and present my findings in class, sometimes some historical anecdotes. And anyway, sometimes I would have to produce an advert to sell a product. And in fact, I just chose for that advert to sell a product, I decided to choose frying pans. And then I made a poem about frying pans and how how good they were, and because I wanted everybody to buy it. And of course, then we had to make it very didactic. I mean, it was a presentation, but it was material that we were going to use in a class. Anyway, I didn't give much thought to that. Did my presentation, finished it, and then the teacher just took me aside and he says, well, I mean, I really enjoyed that, and the rest of the class as well. And then she said something. She said, you would make a very good English teacher. And I just couldn't believe what she was saying. I was just really taken aback, because the last thing I wanted was to become a teacher. I just couldn't see myself facing a class of perhaps 20 odd students, and perhaps because I was shy, or not necessarily shy, but I felt always very intimidated by teenagers, but probably because of the proximity in age. I wasn't that old, but I wasn't as young as a teenager. And that was something that really made me think, and then I decided to become a teacher.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example, Maria. Thank you very much for that. And that again goes back to this confidence building or confidence giving aspect of feedback. Maria, I can also see that you've asked a question in the question and answer box.
Yes.
Does it imply that students somehow are responsible for their own learning when we put them at the center of learning? That's a very good question. Thank you very much for that. Yes, I think that students are responsible for their own learning. But this is something that, I don't know if that's your experience, but it's certainly my experience, in certain cultures, students are not taught to be independent learners. So because I believe that students should be independent learners, and that they should be responsible for their own learning, because that's what makes learning most effective. Sorry, I try to build that kind of responsibility in them by, again, talking to them, giving them appropriate feedback. But of course, you can lead the horse to the water, you can't make them drink. You can work on developing that responsibility for their own learning in students, but you can't force them to do it. It's their choice. And I think that's your responsibility as a teacher is respecting, giving the students the opportunity to take responsibility for their own learning, but respecting their wish if they don't want to do it, and no, I don't like the fact that they don't want to take responsibility for their own learning, but it's their choice. It's, they have the right to choose that if they want to. And I think Maria wants to say something again, because she's raised her hand.
Yeah, I want to say something about this aspect of making students, well, encouraging students to take responsibility for their own learning. That's something I always encourage, and probably was a result of my experience at university. And then I started working on, well, with projects from, in the 80s, in the early 80s. I was already working with my students projects, on projects, and then they had to, I would give them a project or ideas. I also encourage them to give me ideas. That's not always easy, but then I could, I realized that once I gave them the responsibility, they just would work with great enthusiasm. Of course, I mean, what happens when you just divide them in groups, you always get the weaker student, but then you always, we always used to find tasks. We always find tasks for the weakest student.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the most advanced students, you try to combine, the levels.
Mm-hmm.
And I just found that, you give them the responsibility of working on a project, and you give, of course, you give the guidelines, you give, the tempo, everything, and then they just come out with the most fascinating things, and they feel really
Absolutely.
proud,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah. I agree totally. I think again, if you start thinking about motivation and what it is that motivates people in general, not just language learners, but what motivates people in general is when they have something meaningful to do. Okay, and if you take responsibility for your own learning, that learning becomes personally meaningful to you, and that gives you motivation. And it's the best kind of motivation because it's internal motivation. It's the motivation that comes from you and not from somewhere outside, from your parents, your teachers, etc., etc. So yeah, that's a very good example. Thank you very much for that, Maria. I would like to ask Gulbin, because Gulbin, you gave an example of the best feedback and the worst feedback, and I thought these examples were very, very interesting. Would you like to say a couple of words about those? Okay, so let me just remind you what Gulbin said. She said the best was on one of my lessons, as my students told me that one of my students told me she'll be a teacher like me because she always feels blissful after English classes. And I think that's probably the kind of feedback that we would like to hear after every single class that we give. It's so good to know that students, if students want to become like us, then that is the highest compliment that you can get. And remember that a compliment is the kind of feedback as well. Okay, so that was a very good example. And you also mentioned the what was it? Hold on, because that now I've lost it. Okay, the worst one was from one of my teachers. You'll easily give up when you start working at a state school and lose hope as the years pass by. Yeah, I think this is it's a different kind of feedback. Obviously, it's connected with the teaching profession in general. And I think, again, this is something that I have seen done by teachers to other teachers. And this is something that is, I think, a bit of a problem in the teaching profession, where people who are discouraged or demotivated kind of throw that at other people as well. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I can understand that people can experience burnout or loss of motivation, etc. But I don't necessarily agree with people throwing kind of or pushing their negative emotions onto other people. But that's just my personal point of view. Gabby, I think it might be time for your other question or questions.
Okay, so that's essentially something that made me, when I was watching a video and you gave this example of the sandwich approach, okay, and that made me think that I mean I don't see the problem with the sandwich approach say. What I think the problem is here is the problem of variety and uniformity of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with the sandwich approach is its uniformity. Okay, so if you always rely on the same way of providing feedback, then this is predictable. If it's predictable, the feedback is not as effective as it should be, I think.
Yeah.
So that's why it made me think when I was watching that it is so important to have this variety in the way we offer feedback. So that's why I hate this "well done" expression, because again, that's uniformity. Okay, that's just saying it over and over and over again. Fine, well done means I'm a good student. But then it's just so predictable. I know that when I give the right answer, my teacher is going to say well done. Okay, so it would just be nice to hear something different for a change. Okay, anything but just variety, as opposed to this uniformity. And this is the problem with the sandwich approach, because I don't really see the actual approach as a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder how you feel about it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you very much for that, Gabby. Yes, I think uniformity is an issue here, but for me personally, the issue is that you have, because in the sandwich it's basically good, bad, good. Okay, and what I'm not happy about is the bad bit in the middle. And what I'm also not happy about is the fact that a sandwich approach does not provide a way forward. So if we just stick to the sandwich model on its own, then it is problematic precisely because it talks about the bad things. And okay, yeah, I made a mistake, but what do I do with it now? It doesn't really provide any answers. It doesn't show the way forward. Okay, so that's why I think that when I first started hearing that people are beginning to kind of consider this approach as a cynical approach, at first I was very surprised, because this is, as a teacher trainer years ago, I was actually taught to use the sandwich approach to feedback, and I did use it for quite a while before I started thinking, I'm not sure this is what works. And I really think it doesn't work, precisely because it doesn't give you the way forward. And I think that feedback should show you what are the areas that you need to change. Okay. But, an area that you need to change, does that mean it was bad? No, I don't think so. Maybe it was, the example that we had earlier of a student using a complex structure, trying to use a complex structure and making a mistake. Was that bad? No, it was actually really brave and really good.
Yeah, I wonder if it's not just a case of now the interpretation or misinterpretation of the word bad. Because bad doesn't necessarily mean bad. Bad means something to work on. So you have something positive, something to work on, and that's the sandwich approach. So I think that the issue then is with the use of the word bad, right? Because that's bad.
I think, but because we are in, we as teachers of a language, we are in the communications business, and so I believe that as people whose subject matter is communication, we should be accurate and appropriate in how we use language. So because bad is so kind of, it's a non-starter, and that's why I don't think we should be using it. I think, but yeah, that was a very good point, Gabby. Yes, I agree.
And I agree with you, Anya. So I guess my understanding of the sandwich approach is that, you see, I don't see this bad for what it is. I see it as just another way of saying things to work on. So I don't really get the negative connotations as much. So
Yeah.
this is why I don't see any issue
Yeah.
with the sandwich approach. But
Sure.
then
Yeah.
that's because bad is not bad.
It's
in
not
this.
necessarily bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you see, this is the beauty of discussing this whole issue of feedback. And that's why I actually, the title of my presentation was The Elusive Art of Feedback, because there's so many kind of subtle things about communication which are so important, precisely because that's something that we teach. You know, we teach communication, so we need to be aware of all those subtleties of communication. And it's actually extremely easy to make somebody feel really bad about something, and really frustrated about something, really angry about something, just by using the wrong words. And you know, ever since some of you may know that I'm also a mediator, and I do a lot of, well, maybe not a lot of work, but some work in the area of conflict management, conflict resolution. And this is also, you know, it is also a communication business. And ever since I started working in this area, on top of my teaching and training, I have become much more aware of how inappropriate communication can affect people, and how inappropriate communication can affect relationships between people. And this is one of the reasons why, you know, when I was talking about the features of effective feedback, one of those features is that, you know, the important thing is relationship between the feedback giver and the feedback receiver. And as I said, this is something very, very important. You know? I can see there is a question from Corinna in the Q&A. How do you give feedback for online classes, especially listening to speaking fluency exercises with groups? Okay, well, that's a very interesting one. Thank you very much, Corinna, for that question. We're obviously finding ourselves in a relatively challenging situation. Okay, it's maybe a little less challenging than it was a year ago, okay, because we now kind of much more used to working in an online environment. I don't know, Corinna, what kind of tool you're using, or what kind of conferencing software you're using for your classes, but in more and more tools, you actually have the possibility of creating breakout rooms, for example. So you do have a possibility of talking to either individuals or small groups of people. Obviously, this will all depend on the size of your group. Because if you're teaching a group of 5, then that's going to be different than if you're teaching a group of 30 or even more. Again, one of the things that I'm going to talk about in the next session, but I'm just going to mention it very briefly. One of the ways in which you can give individualized feedback, for example, if this is what you would like to do, is using, for example, Google Docs, which is a wonderful way of for the students to have individual or one-on-one contact with the teacher, and the ability to, or the possibility of exchanging individualized comments between the teacher and a student. Staying online without necessarily the whole group learning about what was said in that particular feedback. But yes, it is a challenge. It is a challenge. And, you know, we find more and more ways of dealing with that challenge. Again, as I said, it's a little bit difficult to be more specific because I don't know what platform you're using. But as I said, more and more platforms are actually providing breakout rooms, and so there are more possibilities of talking to students in smaller groups or individually, even during the lesson. There's also there's a very interesting model which has been developed fairly recently for online teaching, which is a model in which you have 3 parts of the lesson. The first part is done in groups where students prepare for the main lesson, and there is the main lesson where students collate all the ideas that they came up with in the first part of the lesson. And then at the end, they go back into groups again. And this is where a lot of peer feedback could be happening, for example. So students are divided into smaller groups. They do, for example, a speaking activity where two people are role-playing a situation, and the third person is observing and giving feedback according to a set of criteria which has been set before the activity started. So I hope that helps. Again, you know, to a large extent, it will depend on what platform you are using. Yeah. Okay. There's also some comments about. There's a comment from. Yeah. There's a comment about variety. Variety may mean we give feedback on various things, not only on grammar. For example, the filling of the sandwich approach can be modified a bit, adding after the bad filling what students can do to improve and offer suggestions how to do it. Yes, absolutely. I think whichever model you have been taught, whichever model of giving feedback you have been taught, I think it's important to look at what you are used to doing in terms of feedback and looking at how effective and how successful it is, both in terms of what it is that you would like, or what kind of information you would like to pass on to the students, but also in terms of how the students are benefiting from that feedback. And this is something that you can ask students about, you know, how to what extent do they actually benefit from the feedback that you're giving. And this is again something that I do with my students. I actually ask them about, you know, we talk about what's going to happen, and then at the end we talk about what has happened and how beneficial or not this has been for them, and do they see anything that they would like me to do in a different way, for example. So it's their feedback on me giving feedback.